All right, so my name is Bruce Feinberg. I am the Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for Cardinal Health, and much of my work is focused in working with our health analytics and outcomes research team. And we thought it might be interesting to bring together some of the experts in the field and talk about the continually changing landscape, much of which is political, but as well as economic and even philosophical, and how that changing landscape is impacting this field. And so I'm gonna invite our panelists up. We were thinking about having walk-up music, but Ravinder just couldn't pick anything, and it was a struggle. So Jonathan was going to go with hip hop. And all right, guys, so we're going to get started. And you can see here the folks in front of you. Many of you know them. Many of them have been in the field for quite some time. Hemant Pathak, Senior Director, HEOR at EMD Serrano. Sonia Polgar, MPH, Senior Director, HEOR at Ipsen. Ravinder Dewan, VP and Head of Oncology, Center for Observational and Real-World Evidence, Merck. And Jonathan Kish, PhD, Director, HEOR, Cardinal Health Specialty Solution. And with that, I'm going to sit and join the panel, and we're just going to have a conversation. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning.
So I'm kind of intrigued because for those who are now becoming the news junkies, and they start every morning with the New York Times news brief and then move from there as their numerous listservs come up, it's interesting to see the way that the media is approaching healthcare. And it's not just media, but obviously it's the polls and it's the legislation. And the biggest legislation for healthcare in my mind of the last year was the 21st Century Cures Act. It's interesting that the legislation specifically calls out real-world evidence and specifically calls out even elements of real-world evidence like patient-reported outcomes. And what I'm interested in and concerned about is, given that changing focus and given the fact that that is really coming after the Sunshine Act and other types of legislative changes in the way pharma companies really start to interact and think about how they're going to approach healthcare, how that's starting to reset what's happening within each of your companies, the way you're starting to think about what is the work that your group is going to do, how is that going to be different, is it more expansive, are the types of trials and research that you're doing going to change, are your budgets increasing? But I'm really curious of how all that is being impacted. So Ravinder, you're closest to me. I'll put it on you. I'll let you go first.
It's interesting you mentioned the news, changing every day in this space, and I kind of, in a way, missed that act on November 30th or 28th. It came out, right? Mm-hmm. Just before Obama was supposed to leave. So
all right, do I hear more volume is needed? All right.
It didn't catch that much of attention, right? So, but nonetheless, I think it's an interesting area from our standpoint. We just have to sort of, what we're thinking within our organization is we need to, in fact, invest more in this area. There's no question about it. I think from a real-world evidence standpoint, there's going to be more and more focus. We are getting the insights that we have never gotten before. And when you look at the whole continuum of drug development, the real-world evidence is going to provide you insights not only at the time we are launching the drug or beyond after launch, which typically people focus on, but it's going to provide you insights into the early drug development where you don't have enough data to look at what could be your endpoints, what could be your comparators, what could be the population that you will be focusing on. So there are a whole host of things that you can address getting into the real-world evidence even prior to launches. So I think we think that this is an area where we need to focus really on, and this is the area where there's a lot of attention is going to be, and I think the right attention within the law that we need to sort of invest more on that. So I think from our standpoint, we're going to be investing more and more as we move forward.
Matt?
Yeah, so
It's interesting, right? Means whenever Washington gets excited about something, we all get excited. But a lot of people in this room are already experts on real-world data or modeling. So I'll be preaching to the choir if I had to tell them how to do the job, right? But to Ravindra's point, what this has done is it has thrown
More volume.
more volume. Okay. So what this has done is essentially throw a lot of other players within a company into the mix now. It's not just about producing the evidence, it's also about how you communicate the evidence and what are the legal boundaries around that. So whenever legal steps in, things get really interesting. We in HOR, we like our assumptions, we like our models, we believe we are doing the best science possible. Legal may think otherwise. So this is, for us, internally, this has been more of a communication issue, an education issue. So some of the tools we are using to get people to the speed of what it means to live in this new world is to essentially educate them on what are the good practices look like for real-world data or the modeling. So spot checklists are very important. There are some of the other communication issues around unapproved indications or when the product is not approved for anything in the market, or when the product is approved for one indication and we are looking for another indication coming in. In oncology, this is very true. So then we are talking about what kind of evidence is required in that space. And so we are kind of helping our legal team understand what it means or what is the competent and reliable sciences and what kind of tools exist out there. So Green Park Initiative or SPORS checklist, all those are good tools that we use to educate them on what good looks like, what should they expect when they evaluate a piece, and just getting them comfortable with what the real world data is and how that should be incorporated into our dissemination channels.
So Sonia, if I extrapolate a little bit on Hemant's comments, it would almost sound as if HECOR is kind of moving from this ivory tower that we're interested in academic questions to becoming more strategic in their thinking as they help their companies. And so I'm curious if that's something I know. So we talked last night about the fact that I wasn't going to throw out a curveball, and that question I'm asking her was not on the list. So
okay.
this is going to happen. You might as well get used to it now. We've had an hour together. But I am curious about, it does sound to me that the Med Affairs groups and the health economists are starting to, not that they were never thinking this way, but it sounds like they're being asked to be more strategic.
So I think that, I can only speak for myself, and my views are my own and not of my company, so I should say that.
Does everyone want to say that now and just get
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, we
Yes.
forgot.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I honestly think that I've always tried to be strategic and find areas of shared value, and so that's really how I've approached things. And in a little bit of contrast to what Ravinder was saying, I don't think that this really changes anything from our company's perspective or my perspective in terms of real-world evidence. We've been doing it, and I know many of you in the room have been doing it. I think that the external environment is validating how important it is. So the fact that you use real-world evidence to extrapolate efficacy in real-world populations that are maybe a little outside of the restricted clinical trial population, we're still doing that. We've been doing that. Looking at the question versus efficacy versus effectiveness, I think we're still looking at that. And then really the ability to measure long-term outcomes. You can't sometimes do that practically in an RCT environment. We've been doing that. I've been doing that for a decade. So I think that the external environment is very encouraging with respect to RWE. It validates what we've been doing. I think that there are some places for expansion and maybe perhaps some more investment. But I think that for me, it really validates the importance of what we've been doing already.
So what I'm hearing is that the 21st Century Cures Act not so much changes your world, it validates for the rest of industry, and maybe it validates to the broader public and even the awareness now of all the limitations of randomized clinical trials. And
Absolutely.
so in oncology, for those who aren't familiar with the stats, somewhere in the range of 3% of adults participate in RCT. And so clinical trials that are being done in a very small population that isn't even representative because they're younger, they're healthier, they're less diverse. And beyond that, they're probably also more literate in terms of healthcare. They're also more committed to their healthcare. So there's huge differences, much of which have been clearly accepted by leadership. The past president of ASCO, was clear in stating that clinical trials are not representative. And so it's putting more pressure, though. And one of the areas where it puts more pressure that I'm very curious about is, and Ravindra, you mentioned drug launch. And there's all this expense that occurs in the process. And then a drug is launched, and it just seems that not adequate resources are being put to understanding what happens in the immediate period. So I'll share a quick example in my own practice. When irinotecan came out back in 1999, and that IFL regimen was first used in my practice, and my first patient landed in the intensive care unit, as did one of my partner's first patients. And we then did our own research with our new EMR and found 17 of the first 20 ended up in the hospital, and realized this regimen wasn't used for prime time. Now, it wasn't for prime time in the reality of those patients. None of them were like the patients in the trial for numerous reasons. The most significant of which was that those patients in the trial had no prior 5-FU exposure, and every patient being treated in the real world had already been exposed. So, but it does raise this issue that I started a process in my own practice whereby every new regimen and every new drug, we looked at the first 20 patients before we started generalizing what could be done. And I'm amazed by how little research is done, that you don't see the first 50 patients, the first 100 patients, the first 200 patients, and these sequential reports coming out, where often the patients being treated, regardless of the scenario and the disease, are usually not representative of those who are in the trial. Is there a focus to start to understand this in that earlier, and so you're shaking your head, so I'll let you go first. But it's always been surprising to me, and I'm curious how, it seems that that's where real world is so critical. It's great to know 2 years and 3 years, a pattern of care study or resource utilization, but as that drug enters the market, how is it being used and whom is it being used? What are the outcomes we're seeing and how are they different? And how do we need to educate providers who are prescribing if they're deviating from where the drugs maybe have their ultimate application?
I think there are a couple of things. One is, if you look at the law, right, I mean, there's a tremendous focus on the fact that it talks about RWE and how we're going to utilize that in the future. So that puts an emphasis on that, the whole area, right? I think the issue is that you seeing FDA now obviously is expediting a lot of the approvals, which is based upon some of the early data in oncology. And you're seeing approvals based on response rates and single-arm studies and things like that. And that is going to put more and more onus on how do we actually see patients react to that in the real world. So there's going to be even added sort of focus on to justify and also develop the real world outcomes on these patients. How are they reacting to that in the real world after the drug is approved in the first 3 months, first 6 months, first 9 months, to your point? The issue there is how do we collect that data, right, in that early stages? And you're approving drug on response rates, and all you're going to capture in the first 6 months, 9 months is response rate again. So, you need to sort of wait a little bit to get to the second round of outcomes to see whether the drug is performing to the extent that it was supposed to. So we get into that situation pretty much on every day when we have discussions internally. How long is long enough to sort of go out and collect that long-term data and justify what the clinical trials have shown?
All right, so Jonathan, so you're up on that end. How long is long enough, and how quickly can you start to look at what may be differences and get a sense of how the real world data may start to look differently than the trial data?
Right, so I think, doing some research on this topic a little bit more this morning and late last night, one of the stats that came into mind was that a lot of approvals are based on less than 6 months of follow-up, or on average 6 months of follow-up for the patients in the trials. So that's kind of the bare minimum that folks are kind of using right now as the basement when you think about, well, how much is enough to move forward. And in our work, it depends obviously on specifically to oncology, the tumor type, and when you might be able to observe those outcomes. So if they are worse prognosis diseases, then perhaps a response might be valuable, in less than 6 months after, or 6 to 12 months. But again, longer latency, multiple myeloma, where there's durable remission achieved now with some of the newer agents. It takes time to build those databases and be able to evaluate some of those outcomes. And then matching it all together, right? So whether you need laboratory data combined with the pathology reports and all of those components to come together to tell the story of how the drug is actually performing. So to get back to your original question of how long is long enough, I think it depends. And the real trick is being able to follow those patients over time, link them, collect robust and reliable measures on them without going down the route of a full trial. So if the methodology develops and the databases are rigorous enough to be able to do that, then we'll be at that point where we can use it more effectively.
Yeah, so,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so I think,
This is exactly what I want. I want you guys to start talking. If people forget that I'm here, it'll be perfect.
yeah, so it's interesting what Jonathan said, and the original intent was 3% of the population is in the trial. So what do we do with the rest of the population, right? Means there is a lot of people who do not make the cut because they are getting excluded because of certain criteria or conditions. And one potential approach, and this will depend on how comfortable the legal in your, again legal, or medical teams are in terms of what is eligible for early access programs. Sometimes early access programs are very strictly related to, restricted to that indication, and sometimes they are broader than that. Each company, there is no one definition of EAP. It depends from company to company, but potentially what can be offered is those excluded patients can be enrolled into more open label, which are not going to the evidentiary standard of regulatory approval, but they need treatment. And that data can be collected side by side of the people who are getting in the trial, and that information can be extremely useful. Maybe the endpoints can be different, maybe the frequency with which we check can be different, maybe that can be more pragmatic in nature because we are making a drug available on a compassionate basis in that case, but the data are useful. Now, some companies would not allow us to use efficacy endpoints coming from, even if you have the information from EAP, it's mostly for safety reporting, not so much of efficacy reporting. So things are evolving on this front, and some companies have done really well using the EAP data to get into the regulatory package, and some companies have done a bit differently. So, but yeah, these patients need treatment. They are screened, and the question is, what do you do with them when they are getting excluded? So, there was a panel by FDA on, or Friends of Cancer Research, FOCR, that actually had Dr. Califf, Dr. Putzer, and I think Janet Woodstock and others on that panel, and they basically said, they were pushing for this concept called regulatory intent analysis. So yeah, you collect the data, you have a more exploratory hypothesis in play, and you are basically looking at more of a, I wouldn't say data mining, but you are looking at what information is collected and how that can eventually make it to the regulatory package. So very interesting, very preliminary thoughts, I guess, from the panel on that issue, but personally, this is coming from the global team that attended that panel, not so much me, but from my company. But it sounded interesting and sounded like things were moving in the right direction. But again, EAPs are very, very company specific, so it may not apply from what happens in Ravinder's company to mine to what happens in Jonathan's company.
I'm curious. Please
Yeah.
go ahead, but I also want you to address the difference between EAP versus registries in terms of getting that information.
Yeah, so I wanted to, I thought the example that you set up this set of questions was really interesting. The real world clinical experience as a clinician, looking at the first 50 patients and really assessing what was going on and seeing a signal in a few and testing it in the broader set of your clinic. And I'm really intrigued by that. I'll go back to the EAP question, but I'm really intrigued by that because I think it's really, there are kind of the standard ways, like the early access program that companies put into place for patients that need the drug, perhaps slightly prior to approval. Registries right after approval. I've been exposed to both of those aspects, but one of the things I think that's emerging is that there is much more awareness with RWE, and I think that with that, and there's legislative mandates, there's a lot of questions that patients, clinicians, et cetera, want to ask. So I think there's this push for collaboration and new ways of working within data providers, within researchers, et cetera, to really be able to do what you did in a microcosm of your clinic in a broader way. And I think that that would be very, very useful. I think that some of the challenges have been in the traditional databases, there are lags. So a product launches, and you may not get to see the full experience of what happens with that drug until 6 months, a year later. But now there are some databases or data assets that are actually much shorter lag. And so what you did in the clinic, for your patients to do right by them, we could do more broadly. So I think that's something to explore. But, so you want me to go into EAPs and registries a little bit?
Sure.
So I kind of did a little bit with the early access program and registries. I mean, they're embarked on for specific reasons. Early access is really that. It's a channel by which patients can get the drug in an early access format. And as Hemant mentioned, it's really safety-oriented. With registries, I think you have an a priori set of questions you want to answer. And sometimes that can be confining because maybe what you found in the clinic wasn't really apparent to people as they were setting up that registry. So I think that there's a place for both of these, but I think that there's also an opportunity for new ways of working, new data sets, new collaboration models. So that's what I'm really interested in right now and excited about.
Good segue for where I want to go. So Ravinder, you talked about difficulty in the lag time, specifically looking at response. But there's limitations beyond that with response. And one of the most significant is that with real-world evidence, you can't use the traditional clinical response. You're not able to have central review of RECIST criteria, certainly for tumor measurements in oncology, but it's complicated in a lot of fields. And so we've got these surrogate measures, a time to treatment progression or time to next therapy, or we try to come up with ways to discern the benefit that was achieved with therapy 1 in the sequence versus therapy 2 in the sequence. And how critical is it that we develop new tools to address this?
I think it's extremely critical. I mean, that's the reason why we're not getting much traction. And I must admit, the RWE is not getting that kind of traction yet. And the jury is still out there, how useful, how validated, the data that we're producing is in terms of the real decision making. And one of the reasons, obviously, is what you just outlined, because we don't have much of confidence in, the way we are collecting the data, how we are interpreting, because you are now in the real world rather than in a controlled environment where we're collecting the data in a very controlled fashion. So we need to come up with better measures which are more acceptable from the real world standpoint and validate them and quickly. I mean, that's what is needed. One of the key things that we continue to face is the progression, which you just outlined. I mean, we look at all kinds of different EMR systems, and that is one of the biggest struggles we have. We just don't have the real validated measures to measure progression. So if we can sort of harness all our collective energies and go in that direction and start to work together. I know FDA is investing a bit. I mean, last year, a couple of initiatives. One of them was with Flatiron as well, the EMR system to sort of look into the non-small cell lung cancer data. So those are the kinds of things I think will provide us more confidence as we move forward. But we need to validate quickly.
All right, let me pause for 1 second. For those standing in the back, you may choose and want to be standing in the back, but if you actually prefer to be seated, we have many chairs available over in this section that I'm pointing to over here. I'd say there may be 20 chairs in that section. So we'll let you make a little movement. God, they're so orderly and well-behaved. Doctors don't act this way. This is great, you're working with all these PhDs. Clinicians, I should say not doctors, clinicians, excuse me. I do have my bias.
So Bruce, I wanted to just jump on what Ravinder was saying about the outcomes in real-world data, and especially in oncology. I think that RECIST criteria are not used in the real world quite very often. I think that even in chronic diseases, you know, even in therapeutic areas like diabetes, you know, you think that they go to the doctor every 3 months at a clip, and it just doesn't happen in the real world in this way. So I think that you do have to come up with an operational definition. I think there are issues with validity, but it depends on what your objective is for the research. So we're working in neuroendocrine tumors, and neuroendocrine tumors are sometimes not measurable. Often they're slow growing, and so RECIST criteria and that framework outside of an RCT becomes very problematic. But they do still present substantial clinical burden. So in the context of real-world studies we're doing, we came up with an operational definition with physicians, to your point. It's not validated, but as they're making clinical decisions, there was some assessment of progression. So, I mean, if you guys are interested, we looked at a composite where we looked at some measure of clinical worsening. So whether it was a scan, biomarker, or just a subjective clinical assessment of the patient looks worse, plus a change in therapy. So that's how we were able to address it for our particular disease state. And I think that these surrogate endpoints will really have to be specific to the tumor type in conjunction with clinical experts. And it will not be validated out of the gate, to Ravinder's point, but I think it's a journey. Validation will be a journey for these endpoints.
So Jonathan, we've been working in this area because, you know, my awareness of it and concern has kind of, you know, percolated ideas. You want to talk about some of the ideas that are not yet validated, but we have posters and, you know, that are coming up at this meeting to start to generate some thought?
Sure. So a couple thoughts there. I think just to start and go back for 1 second, we were talking about providers and all of the rest. I think the buy-in, there's going to be a level of buy-in needed from oncologists, hematologists. We've seen in a lot of our research internally at Cardinal through some summit exercises and work we do with providers that there's still a level of doubt that exists regarding real-world evidence and how it can impact treatment and treatment paradigms and protocols and the rest. And I think, you know, reading through some other commentaries in the New England Journal and other places, you still continually see that, right? That real-world evidence will never be, according to the doctors, able to prove efficacy. It's great for utilization, it's great for safety, but there's a very, 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 very high bar that would have to be achieved.
Although what's fascinating about it is that for clinicians, they offer that as their subjective assessment of use, and yet in their everyday practice, it permeates everything they do. So they will take a drug that came out, capecitabine, Xeloda, and they uniformly dose it at 20% dose reduction because their collective experience is the toxicities were too great. But then they'll still refer to, you know, the primary trial data, even though it's their own experience which is driving their current use.
I mean, part of that is educational, you know, and having a vocabulary to describe what you're actually using. So maybe it's a disconnect between what they think of as real world and what is actually real world evidence. And so that educational component might be important for providers moving forward. In terms of response in oncology and what we've been doing there and kind of that kind of work, you know, we kind of started down this road because when we're conducting real-world studies, a client may be interested in understanding what was the level of response, complete response, partial response, stable disease, et cetera. And so it started with just a basic question of providers and their interpretation of that response. And so we would get results that were just really, you know, out of whack, I guess, for lack of a better term. If you see a response rate of 75% reported by across all the providers, then you're starting to think, well, what are they thinking when they think of response? It could be that they're thinking that my patient is feeling better. That's a response to me. You know, there's the lack of that rigorous operational definition that Sonia was referring to. So to kind of correlate and work between that, I think it's important to understand what providers feel is happening with the patient. It's almost like a physician-reported outcome to a certain degree. But at the same time, collecting the data, whether it's through a chart review or if possible through an EMR, et cetera, which you can use to corroborate or do some kind of sensitivity and specificity of that analysis is an important part. And I think now we're able to get at some of that with the data sets that are available.
So a poster which we'll have at this meeting, which I think is interesting because it starts to really take a deeper dive in the possibilities, is we did the typical subjective assessment, and given that much higher partial response rate than was published in the literature, we went back and asked those physicians if they could take bidimensional measurements from the pre-scan and the scan at the time of the maximum response and record that information and send it back. That was part 2. And we were able to get about 80% of the physicians to do that. And when you go by something akin to a RECIST criteria, it reduced those partial remissions by half and removed all complete responses. So we have this disconnect between the clinical benefit and the scans looking better and the patient feeling better, so it's a partial response to, we actually made measurements and it was only a 30% bidimensional shrinkage. It wasn't a 50% bidimensional shrinkage, which raises interesting questions even about what is more meaningful. Is it that perceived clinical benefit, that the patient is experiencing and the physician, accepts, or is it the strictness of that hard and fast definition? But it is interesting what you can do that start to go beyond just looking at an EMR, where you're only going to have that subjective assessment in the narrative. And even with natural language processing, can you extract those measurements from reports, or you're going to have to go directly to physicians or nurse abstractors who are going to then extract that information. So it just raises new possibilities that if we think about real-world evidence, there may be what we need within the evidence. We're just going to have to come up with new methodologies to be able to get to it and make it meaningful.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, one thing we need to think about is we are thinking about a population that we are interested in, and but these physicians are also treating other tumors. They're also treating patients before our study time frame. So there is a bias, a physician assessment bias, or the way they practice that sets in. And if we capture that by setting a study period cohort or a contemporary cohort from other tumors, we may be able to adjust for some of these biases. So what happens is that information is missing sometimes, and we kind of either attribute it to the efficacy estimation or the way they look at the progression. So it increases the cost of the study, but it is something, it will be a right thing to do in this case. And something to ponder upon, for making sure that the real world data are considered as a valid evidence. Because, you're absolutely right, that's how physicians practice, and we need to respect that, but we also need to control for how their nuances and some practice nuances in this case. And we don't necessarily do that all the time, or, something to think about as a good practice, add it to the checklist.
So I think that it really also goes back to the objective of your assessment. So you asked a very interesting question. Is the clinical benefit that was kind of observed by the clinician, the patient was doing better, and Jonathan, to your point, they just looked better, felt better, versus the RECIST criteria? I mean, obviously, or this modified bidimensional measurement. I mean, I think it really goes to, I think nomenclature is very important. So if you call it the same thing as RCTs, well, and it's very different, and you find a spurious result, like 70% response, that's going to just really irk people. So I think that the nomenclature is really important. What you call a complete response, partial response, et cetera. If it's fixed in physicians' minds of a certain thing that's really rooted in how it's used in RCT, I think we should probably call the RWE endpoint something slightly different. That's my personal view. And then what is the objective? Is the objective, to really prove overall survival, to really assess that very cleanly, or progression-free survival, actually? Overall survival is very objective, so I think we can do that in RWE pretty clearly. But for PFS, or some proxy measure of progression, I think that, we just have to keep our objective in mind, definitions very clear, otherwise people will get confused. That's just my 2 cents.
So Ravinder, you mentioned before about validation.
Yeah.
And one of my concerns with validation is what it takes to validate, how far you have to go, to what extent it's almost like the perfect getting in the way of the good. Where do we have to go if we're going to validate these alternatives? And will they be enough if we're going to fulfill the mandate of the 21st Century Cures Act in order to use real-world evidence to start to allow for label expansion? You're talking about a tremendous onus that now is being put upon this industry to be able to validate these types of measures to the extent that we're going to now be taking, to some degree, you could say, putting patients at risk. We're going to be giving them drug, that is now for conditions that were not fully vetted in traditional clinical trial.
I think at the end of the day, what you're looking at is the tumor progression, right? And the tumor burden, how the tumor is evolving over time. And that's just a measure that essentially tells you whether the patient is progressing and what time to make the right clinical decisions. So if you can sort of develop a criteria which is maybe a RECIST/RWE, it's a RWE RECIST rather than our strict RECIST criteria that we just need to develop that and do more and more studies. I think that would raise the confidence. I don't think we invest too much in oncology, particularly from RWE standpoint, and validate some of the measures that clinicians are using in their practices. So the more we do, the more we come out with the evidence, I think that would essentially raise the confidence and provide us that validation.
And so are companies like yours pushing more budget, into your field?
It's a struggle. It's a balance that you need to strike. Where obviously, we see that from an HUR standpoint, that we need to sort of invest more and more. But the management is going to look at it a different way. So it's a balance that we need to strike, work with our R&D colleagues from their standpoint. The drug is approved, and we've actually shown that the drug works. And it's out there, it's getting used. And so we need to continuously work on that and continue to enhance the value and bring back how the drug is performing in the real world. And that's the balance that we have to sort of deal with on a daily basis. But in general, I would say, I think there is a more and more awareness within the companies that how the data that we are generating is enhancing the knowledge base and the education in the community. And that is sort of feeding into this and allowing us to do more and more.
Sayman, any examples within your group of where you're actually looking at using real-world evidence for a label extension and rather than a defined clinical trial?
The label extension is can be looked at in various different ways, right? Means we do not enroll patients, and most of the times, performance status 2 and above will be excluded from the trials. These are the patients who actually will be treated in the real world. And if we can accurately capture performance status in the real world, hard thing to do, that can be a contributory evidence to the expansion of a label because that patient population was not necessarily covered. Now, if you pitch a study, to Ravindra's point, the question is going to be, management is going to say, well, there are other areas of priorities that we need to address, but something HOR can contribute to. One area that is missed a lot and doesn't get talked about a whole lot is in ultra-rare tumors, where it is very difficult to do a phase 3 randomized trial. A lot of times, the real-world cohorts act as a historical controls, and you will see this language in the label all the time, as compared to historical controls. And that is most of the time there is a real-world data study riding in the back from which, which has been supplied to FDA as a part of the regulatory package and is sitting with them and has really good data on patients, on historical basis. And that's a HOR contribution right there. And we cannot talk about it because it doesn't show up in the label. But I see that as an area of opportunity in future where if FDA is willing, that information can be made available as to show, not on comparative basis, but just has to show like how these patients were treated before and how these patients are, like what is available now. Because the study is already done, it's already provided. It's sitting in the back, we can publish it, then we can talk about it. But the line exists in the label. It says, as compared to historical control, I just would like to see more details. So apart from label extension, it's also about how we interpret the label, what information gets in label, that's also important.
So Jonathan, one of the reasons, specifically in oncology, but I think it crosses all research, for clinical trials to be so limited, is that clinical trials are really part of a restricted network of sites. They're done in many academic centers, and like, for instance, in community practice, our practice was huge. My practice had 28 locations, but only 4 of those locations participated in clinical research because the physicians were committed and willing to be PIs and willing to have the rigor in the way they approach their patient care. And I'm curious, in order for real-world evidence, for us to get to that next level, is it going to require a kind of similar type of research network that's going with that greater sense of commitment, so that whether we're doing bidimensional measurements, from radiographic reports as opposed to just subjective best response, but is it going to take that kind of more restricted network of providers in order to get that information? Because so much of that issue comes up with the garbage in, garbage out. When you look at EMRs, so much of it has been poorly documented. Claims a little bit cleaner, but so many answers not there. So do you think that as physician research networks are going to become part of the story?
Absolutely. I think that the critical component is kind of in the idea that there is an active sense of data collection and passive, right? So EMRs, claims, the rest is passive. That gets generated as the patient moves through the system. The provider has an intervention, things happen. When you get to more detailed, rigorous assessments, so the need for validation of measures for proxies, when you move from survival to back to progression to response to et cetera, to biomarkers, that involves a level of detail that's just not going to be passively collected, perhaps, in real-world data. So I think as we need more active participation from providers, it will be imperative to have that type of connection to practices. Perhaps you may lose some of the generalizability to a certain extent. You're shifting it a little bit.
To get more sophisticated providers who maybe participate.
Right, exactly. So I think that's a key. Back when I was a grad student, we did something called community-based participatory research. And the whole idea there was that you involved all of the stakeholders from the inception of the study design throughout the reporting and the rest, as opposed to kind of helicopter research where you drop down and you're there and then you're out. And this is a really successful tool and methodology and approach because people are bought into the system and they can feel and actually appreciate the outcomes of the research. And I think building a network where you have providers who are consistently involved, aware of real-world evidence, contributing to the discussion, will allow you to get to those outcomes you're interested in.
So related to the concept of a research network to start to be able to accomplish the goals that we've been talking about, part of that research is not only going to be dependent upon providers providing the information, but again, going back to 21st Century Cure Act, increasingly it's also going to require patients providing that information. And it seems to me in this kind of nascent period of PRO, the industry's been great at developing the tools to work with, validating PROM, really starting to get the framework with which we can do it, but recruiting patients. And in the same way, recruiting patients who are representative seems to be the barrier and the hurdle to really expanding this research. And I'm curious to get your responses on to the extent to which you're actively pursuing PRO and the difficulties you may be having in the recruitment. Who wants to go on this one? Don't all fight.
So I think that the physician network example and the community-based research, I love that. That's so cool. Versus helicoptering, I think that and bringing people along the journey of your research, making sure that their voice is heard, you hear their questions, you may not be able to incorporate all of them, I think that's really the right way to go, and including patients. You know, in my recent experience, I'm in a U.S.-based role, so a little less with respect to PRO, developing new measures of PRO, but we do rely on physicians already to help us identify patients. I know that my global team worked on a multi-criteria decision analysis framework where obviously we wanted to have physician views as well as patient views, and we used a lot of different recruitment channels. We didn't use an explicit physician research network per se, but I think you touch upon something really interesting with respect to the community-based aspect versus academic, and it's sometimes an artificial divide because, as you say, there's community-based practices that are more like academic research institutions because they have research capabilities, but the majority of patients get treated in community. And so I think that's an interesting place where, you know, things that, like what Jonathan was saying, engaging the community physicians, really trying to understand what we can do to help address some of their real-world questions. I think, you know, for me, I think I'm not quite there with the label expansion thing, even though it's in the 21st Century Cures Act. I think there could be some, you know, prescriptive areas where real-world evidence can play a part in that. I think my sense of what the application of real-world evidence is in that. I mean, I think is engaging the community, engaging a broader set of stakeholders. But
Damon, the PRO problem? We're gonna coin it today, the PRO problem.
So I think the physician PRN networks, and just to link it to the PRO, I think it's important to use PRN networks. I think it's a great recruitment tool. In terms of the PRO implementation through the PRN approach, like a PRN studies which are done through PRN, I think we just have to have a little bit of checks and balance in place to ensure that the assessment is not influenced by physician. You know, the recruitment is facilitated, but the PRO assessment is purely done on patient's volition. So assuming that that's happening.
So do you think that's possible? Do you think that inherently, if physicians are part of the recruitment of the patient, that they've already injected a bias into those patients?
So it's possibility that there may be a bias. The question is, how are we trying to control for it, or how are we trying to assess it, or how are we trying to reduce it? And I think that's where, you know, a good PRO strategy comes in play. There's also, like, some of these PRN networks, especially if they're associated with big organizations, will have their own clinical guidelines, and they may have some of their own assessments going on at the same time. So one tactical aspect that gets influenced is how much burden are we putting on this patient? You know, the patient is not going to be happy responding to the 70th question, asking the same thing in a different scale. So we need to be cognizant of that. And also the guidelines sometimes influence the way the drug is used. So that influences in turn how they look at the outcomes. So we need to be, so using PRN network is a great opportunity, but we need to be aware of what it means for any outcomes, clinical or PRO, in terms of and understanding it. Because if you're changing the dosing frequency, for example, you know, some of the drugs are used at a different schedule than what's in the label. That's going to change the exposure to the adverse events or also the assessment of the side effect, and patient may not be happy about it. And that's going to show up, you know. So we need to be aware of, are we attributing the PRN-based research in the right fashion? Are we accounting for all the changes and differences? So these are more tactical issues, but on a strategic basis, I totally agree. PRN networks are extremely useful, great way to do the studies, and a great way to get patients on a PRO studies as well. Just have to be cautious.
So Ravinder, this caution that Hemant refers to, and I'm just not hearing this overwhelming kind of endorsement that PRO, even though we're seeing so much more of it in the lay press. So your perspective on this?
I think it's one of the issues that I continue to struggle with is we just don't have very patient-centric or patient-relevant measures out there. You know, you got a one set of body which
You've
is
got
in
fact G, and we've got all, I
the
mean,
fact G, all the facts.
Right.
And then in Europe, you have all the QL, QC, 30, you know, the family of instruments, and that's it.
but,
I mean,
but if
then you
if
start,
aggregate them,
you
we're
start
talking about
adding
tens, if
those.
not hundreds.
Yeah,
That's
right,
not
you
enough.
start adding them, and then, you know, the patient burden is enormous when you have 30 questions or 60 questions based upon very prescribed questionnaires, and a lot of them are not relevant for that tumor type where you're studying. So I think we need more of that, and the PRNs are a perfect sort of resource that we can utilize to recruit patients and enhance more data collection on the PRO side of it, and validate again. I mean, it's all coming back to the same issue of, you know, if we can validate and develop more patient-centric, more patient-friendly questionnaires, which provide us the information that we are really looking for in the real world and sort of validate them over time. And these networks, they are almost like a mini registries, right? And you can agree with me that starting a registry from a scratch is an enormous task and very resource-intensive undertaking that people shy away from. So if we can rely on the PRNs, that would be a way to go. I think the other piece that we need to sort of sort out is a lot of the data, particularly oncology, sitting in the unstructured side of the data in the EMR systems. If we can work on that and include some of the important information that we need and move that into the structured side of it and collect regularly, that would also ease the pain.
All right, so we have a few minutes. I want to make sure we have a chance to get a few questions in, although I don't see mics out in the audience. For those who are loud talkers, oh, we do have mics. All right, we have mics. Great. I have a hand up in the front here. If you have an interesting question, put your hand up. We have a few mics that are being passed. So I've got one in the first row. Any time now. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Danica Marinac-Davic, Director of Epidemiology at FDA Center for Devices. I would like to hear your perspective about the tension between the cost of these research networks that you're talking about with regard to what I perceive being really a main driver for that quick adoption of real-world evidence in main initiatives, that is really to get the faster, cheaper, and better studies underway and better, cheaper, and faster evidence. So using real-world data sources. So I know we already touched upon a little bit on it, but you know, if you're talking about really having the evidence being generated now even beyond what were perceived the traditional clinical trials, this may actually be leading to an increased cost.
So, Jonathan, maybe?
Well, I can start and talk a little bit about the cost. So when we're establishing our research network, the critical issue is that, at least from my perspective, providers have an impression of the honoraria, the payment that they may receive from a clinical trial. And so they're kind of basing it off of that idea. And if you're talking about a network and you want to have an institutional agreement with them and you want some sort of long-standing access and discussion with data for the different study designs, then it becomes how do you set that up so that it balances the amount of effort that would be involved in that and comparatively to what they might be reimbursed as a part of a trial. So I think that's, from my perspective, the critical component is finding out what is that, where can we find a sweet spot to encourage participation, obviously not influence anything like that, but where does that sweet spot lie between a trial and this ongoing type of study?
And I might just add that there's a reality check that if you're going to use that physician research network as a critical component of your real-world evidence research, it also has to be, from a budgetary standpoint, it's got to be comparable or competitive with other methodologies. It's got to be competitive with natural language processing at DMR. It's got to be competitive with doing claims-based analyses. And so both in terms of its time frame, how long it's going to take to complete it, but also its cost. And so it adds an additional burden, but that's part of, I think, the design element is it's got to be a comparable, hopefully superior, you know, in some elements, but it's got to be comparable, or, you know, for the researchers on the panel, they're never going to be able to get it approved. And at least early on, until it's more and more validated.
I think I would add that I think we should start with the research question at hand. So, and it could be, you were talking about quick adoption of real-world evidence. So if you have a very specific, very important, critical research question, clinical question that really behooves everyone to answer, I think the will can be created to address it the most efficient, quick way possible. So I think it really boils down to that. I mean, if we're doing kind of pie-in-the-sky research question, then we're not going to get anywhere. So it really depends on that. I mean, if clinicians pose the question, patients pose the question, and it really has teeth, and it's really important for everybody to understand what the answer is, I think that the collective will, both at the company side as well as other stakeholders, they'll gather around that. I mean, we're scientists, I think that we can create the will if the question's important enough.
All right, so we have time for at least one more question. Do I have a hand?
Hi. Yeah. Hi, hello. This is Wan Mei from Merck. So I have a quick question for the panelists that given the law has written down to utilize the real-world evidence to possible use for the label expansion or new indication approval, but there's not much details going on in the law. On the other hand, the industry group has so much experience in connecting the real-world data. I'm curious about, from the panelists, any of you are engaged with the FDA to work out the details? Maybe there's some task force or forums that the FDA roll out to engage you guys.
We're trying to figure that out. I think it's the early stages of that, and we're all kind of intrigued by that, and we need to sort of invest a little bit of time and see what that would require. So I think we need to see that, wait and see.
Yeah, the law was passed on basically December 13, last year was when a lot of things basically got finalized, so to say. So it's a bit early to in this point. Things are not going to move that quick. So we have to kind of look at other initiatives. I mentioned Friends of Cancer Research, where there were a lot of FDA directors were at that meeting, and advocacy was at the table. They discussed something as regulatory intent analysis using real-world data. So those kind of meetings are important, but you will see a lot of these initiatives either coming from patient advocacy side or from some third party, like Green Park Collaboration is one I know, where EMD or more KGA is involved. And that has essentially what we are looking for probably is if you look at FDA guidance and if you look at modeling or indirect comparison, just as example, they refer to ISPOR guidelines as something that we should look at as a evidence for reliable and competent reliable science or something like that. There's a language around that. For real world, we need something like that. So even if it looks very simplistic, we need a checklist that we should be able to check. And then everybody agrees that that is what we have covered in terms of our protocol development, in terms of how we enroll patients. I think we can create a consensus internally, first of all, which is important, and externally that the study is valid. Because right now the major concern is going to be, and frankly, I don't blame FDA or anybody else for that, is that maybe you guys only looked at the patients that were beneficial or that got benefited on your drug. So we need to reduce those kind of biases and we need to have more uniformity. Now we can't go down to the specific study design level, but we can have a good checklist that we can use, which can be provided and is uniform across companies. So for FDA to consider, and ISPOR is a perfect place. Means we have guidelines around real-world data. And maybe we can, and there are checklists in place. If you go to Green Park, everybody who attends Green Park will say, we have our own checklist, we have done this. I think we need one uniform checklist, and that we will agree as an industry or as a community that it's what we will use. And I think that's where I see a lot of harmonization taking place, and where FDA will be able to use that information on a consistent basis.
All right. That's it for time. I want to thank our panelists. Happy to talk to anyone further. Jonathan and I will both be at times at our booth, number 808, and it's great for all of you to come out early in the morning.